Somebody scoops a handful of pale yellow dirt off a hillside in Moravia and adds water. That's the whole recipe. Less rock flour ground to powder by Ice Age wind and dropped across half of Europe, mixed with water and worked between two palms until it holds a shape. Then it goes into the fire, and what comes out isn't dirt anymore. It's a substance that has never existed on this planet before. Not stone, not bone, not wood. A material that human beings made out of nothing but the ground under their feet and heat. That is the invention of ceramics, and it happens here around 26,000 years ago in a cluster of camps below the Pavlov Hills. Now here's the part that breaks the story we usually tell about invention. These people fire thousands of pieces of clay. Thousands. And not one of them is a pot. There are no bowls, no cups, no jars, no storage vessels of any kind. What they make are figurines, women, bears, lions, mammoths, rhinos, and small slabs and lumps and little rolled pellets by the thousand. The single most useful thing you can do with fired clay, the thing that will one day feed and water most of the human species, doesn't get invented for thousands of years after this. The useful thing came second. The strange thing came first, and some archaeologists think the strangest part is that a lot of these objects were never meant to survive the fire at all. Start with the place because the place explains almost everything. This is southern Moravia, in what's now the Czech Republic, in the last cold stretch before the ice sheets reach their maximum. The hills are called the Pavlovs. Below them run a string of settlements, Dolni Vestonice and Pavlov, a short walk to the northeast. That between them holds some of the richest Ice Age archaeology anywhere on Earth. The people here are Gravettian, part of a culture that stretches from Spain to Russia. In Moravia, their local version gets its own name, the Pavlovian, after the hill above the site. Dating puts the occupation somewhere in the window between about 31,000 and 25,000 years ago, with the busiest phase running around 27 to 25,000 years before present. Different labs and different layers give different answers, and the honest version is a range, not a date. What brings people here is mammoth. The valley is a killing ground and a butchering ground, and the bone counts are enormous. They build with it. Bone and tusk frame the huts, hide covers them, less banks the walls against the wind, and they stay. That matters more than it sounds. These aren't people passing through on a 2-week hunt. The camps have real structures, deep hearths, worked floors, refuse piles, graves. People live here long enough to bury their dead in the ground they're standing on, which is one of the surest signs a place has stopped being a stop and started being a home. Now look at the ground itself. It's everywhere in this landscape, in places tens of meters deep. Glaciers grind bedrock into dust. Wind lifts the dust, wind drops it, and over tens of thousands of years it piles up into these soft yellow-gray banks. Quartz, mica, clay minerals, all of it fine as face powder. It's the reason this region has good farmland now. It's also the reason the first ceramics on Earth are made here rather than somewhere else, because less wet down is clay, and clay is the one raw material in the world that changes its nature permanently when you heat it. Somebody in this valley works that out. We can be fairly confident it isn't one flash of genius but a long accumulation of accidents, clay under a hearth baking hard, a hand-shaped lump left too near the coals and coming out changed. But at some point the accident becomes a procedure. Somebody starts doing it on purpose and doing it often and doing it in a structure built specifically for the job. Meet Kella. Kella is a device, a name we're hanging on a person we can't identify, so the story has somewhere to stand. But the person is real in one specific and slightly unnerving way. We have their fingerprints, not metaphorically. Actual ridge patterns pressed into wet clay and then baked permanently into the surface, sitting in a museum in Brno right now. We'll come back to whose they are because the answer isn't what most people expect. The kiln comes out of the ground in 1951 during excavations at Dolni Vestonice, and it isn't much to look at. A round hut, roughly 6 meters across, with a hearth at the middle. Over the hearth, a dome of earth built up around the glowing coals. That's the machine. That's the entire technology. A hole, a fire, and a lid made of dirt. What the dome does is trap heat and hold it, so the temperature inside climbs higher than an open fire would ever reach and stays there. Analysis of the fired pieces puts the working range somewhere between about 500 and 800 degrees Celsius, with most of the material likely fired toward the top of that range, 700 to 800. In Fahrenheit, that's roughly 900 to 1500 degrees. And the firing doesn't take long. The estimate is a matter of hours, not days. A second firing structure, horseshoe-shaped, turns up in a hut further up the slope during the same run of excavations. And a later dig in 1979 finds another domed and banked hearth with around 2,300 pieces of fired clay in it and scattered around it. So this isn't one experimental fire. It's a production site used over and over with the debris to prove it. Now the chemistry, because the chemistry is the surprising part. When the material was analyzed, the composition and mineralogy of the fired objects came back essentially identical to the local soil. No imported clay, no special deposit up the valley, no secret ingredient. They walked outside, dug up the ground they were standing on, wet it, and fired it. Some of the objects, including the famous one, also carry ground bone in the mix. Powdered, charred bone worked into the clay body, the kind of thing a potter today would call a temper, an additive that changes how the material behaves in the fire. Whether that was understood as a deliberate technical choice or is simply the residue of a working surface covered in bone ash, we can't say for certain. Both readings are on the table. What we can say is that the physics worked. At those temperatures, the impurities in less begin to melt just slightly at the points where the grains touch. That thin film of glass welds the particles together as it cools. Materials scientists call it liquid phase sintering, and it's the reason a fired pot is hard and a dried mud pie isn't. Whoever ran this kiln had no theory of any of that. They had a fire, a lid, and a very good practical sense of how hot and how long. And here's the scale of what they pulled off. This is the first time in the history of our species that a human being takes one material and turns it permanently and irreversibly into a different material. Every earlier technology is subtraction and assembly. You knock flakes off a stone to reveal an edge that was always in there. You scrape a hide, you split a bone, you bind things together. The stone is still stone. The bone is still bone. Fired clay is different. The wet lump is soft, soluble, reversible. Leave it in the rain and it goes back to being mud. Put it in the kiln and it can never go back. The chemistry is rewritten. Human beings have crossed from shaping the world to transforming it, and everything from metallurgy to glass to concrete to the silicon in the device you're holding sits downstream of this exact idea. 26,000 years ago, in a hut with a fire and a lid made of dirt. So they've invented the most useful material in human history, and they don't use it for anything useful, not one vessel, no pot, no bowl, no jar, nothing that holds anything. What the kilns produced were animals: bear, lion, fox, mammoth, rhino, horse, human figures, and an enormous quantity of small slabs, balls and pellets that don't obviously depict anything at all. The counts depend on what you're willing to call an artifact. One major study built a working typology from more than 5,000 ceramic pieces. Site inventories that include every scrap of baked clay run past 10,000. Take the middle of that range and you're still looking at thousands of deliberately fired objects from a handful of Ice Age camps, which isn't a hobby. It's an industry, and almost all of it is in pieces. That's the fact that started the argument. Broken archaeology is normal. Everything from 26,000 years ago is broken. But when the fractures were examined closely, they didn't look like the damage that time and soil pressure leave behind. Mechanical breakage, something dropped, stepped on, crushed by sediment, tends to leave a certain kind of clean break. What a lot of these fragments show instead are rough, branching fractures, the signature of thermal shock. The object came apart in the fire violently from the inside. In one analyzed sample of 887 fragments from a kiln area, over half, more than 52%, carried that high-energy thermal shock signature rather than a mechanical one. Thermal shock happens when part of an object expands much faster than the rest and tears itself apart. The classic cause is water. Trapped moisture in a clay body flashes to steam in a hot fire. The steam has nowhere to go and the piece explodes. Any potter who has ever rushed a drying schedule knows exactly what that sounds like. Here's what makes it strange in Moravia. Less has low thermal expansion. As raw materials go, it's actually fairly forgiving, which means the breakage rate isn't easily explained by the material being difficult. Something about how the pieces were going into the fire was producing catastrophic failure again and again. The team that published the major technical study of these ceramics, Pamela Vandiver and colleagues, in the journal Science in 1989, put forward a reading that has been quietly explosive ever since. Their suggestion is this: what if the breaking isn't a failure? What if the breaking is the point? Their phrasing is careful. The making, the firing, and sometimes the exploding of these figurines may have been the prime function of the ceramics at this site, rather than the production of permanent, portable objects. Read that again slowly. On this interpretation, nobody was trying to make a lion that would last. They were making a lion in order to put it in the fire and hear it go. A technology built for an event. For the sound and the heat and the shock of the moment, something that happens in the dark in front of people and is over. Now give the other side its full weight because it deserves it, and because the thermal shock reading is an inference and not a demonstration. Here's what the evidence actually supports. That many fragments broke from thermal stress rather than mechanical force, that's a physical reading of fracture surfaces, and it's reasonably solid. Here's what it doesn't support on its own. Intention. A fracture can't tell you what was in somebody's head. Every one of those breaks is equally consistent with a much duller story. These are the first potters in the world. Nobody has taught them anything. There's no accumulated craft knowledge, no drying schedule handed down, no rule of thumb about how long a piece needs to sit before it can go near heat. A high failure rate is exactly what you'd predict from people inventing the process from scratch. Put half-dry clay in a hot fire and it breaks every time. That isn't ritual, that's a learning curve, and there's a further complication. Some of the baked clay at these sites almost certainly isn't artifacts at all, it's structural. Less floors and banked walls that got fired hard when a hut burned down, deliberately or otherwise. Sorting the objects somebody made from the ground that happened to catch fire is genuinely difficult, and it inflates the fragment counts in ways that are hard to control for. So where does that leave it? With a real disagreement, which is the honest place to leave it. The strong version that these people invented ceramics specifically to make things that would shatter in fire, and that spectacle came before utility by thousands of years, is a striking idea that fits the evidence without being proved by it. The cautious version that they were learning a brand new craft badly and throwing away a lot of failures explains the same fragments with no ceremony required at all. Both readings are live. What neither of them touches is the underlying fact, and the underlying fact is enough on its own. Before there was ever a pot, there were figurines. The first fired clay in the history of the world was shaped into women and bears and lions, not into containers. Cooking pots don't show up until much later. The earliest known pottery vessels anywhere on Earth come from Xianrendong Cave in southern China, dated to about 20,000 years ago, some 6,000 years after the Moravian kilns. And in Europe and the Near East, where the story of pottery usually gets told alongside the story of farming, the first vessels are later still, closer to 9 or 10,000 years ago. Which means that in this part of the world, the useless version of the technology comes first by 15,000 years and more. The order we assume, solve the problem first, decorate it later, runs backwards here. Art isn't what people did once the practical work was finished. On the evidence from this valley, art is what the technology was for. Wet clay records whatever touches it. That's a nuisance if you're a potter and a gift if you're an archaeologist 26,000 years later. The most famous object from these sites is a small figure of a woman, about 11.5 centimeters tall, 4.5 inches, small enough to close a hand around. She was found on the 13th of July 1925 during Karel Absalen's excavations at Dolni Vestonice. She's fired clay with powdered bone in the body, and she's the oldest known ceramic figure of a human being anywhere in the world. Her proportions are the thing people argue about endlessly. Heavy breasts and hips, a rounded belly, arms barely indicated, legs tapering to points, the face reduced to two oblique slits. What she means, we don't know. Fertility, a deity, a portrait, a self-portrait seen looking down at one's own body, a doll, a teaching object. Every one of those has been argued in print, and none of them can be tested. The original lives at the Moravian Museum in Brno and is almost never put on public display. Most of what you've seen is a cast. Then, more than 75 years after she came out of the ground, somebody looked closely at her back. On the left side there's a fingerprint. It's small, around 3 by 5 millimeters, with about 7 ridge lines readable in it. A tomographic scan in 2004 went further and estimated the age of the person who left it. The ridge spacing indicates a child, somewhere between roughly 7 and 15 years old. That doesn't prove a child made her. A finished figure can be picked up, handled, passed around, admired before it dries. A print is a touch, not an authorship. But it does tell you the workshop wasn't a sealed room with one specialist in it. Kids were around this material with their hands on it, and at least one of them left a mark that has outlived their entire world, and there are more prints than that one. Fingerprints turn up across the pellets and lumps in quantity, which is one more reason the pellets are interesting, because whatever else they were held. Then there's the discovery that changed a completely different field, and it came out of the same clay. In 1993, Olga Soffer and James Adavasio were examining fired clay fragments from these Moravian sites when they noticed something on the surfaces that shouldn't have been there. Impressions, regular, woven, unmistakably structured. Textile, not the fabric itself, that rotted away 26,000 years ago along with every other soft thing at the site. What survived was its negative, a print left where woven cloth pressed against wet clay before the fire locked the impression permanently into the surface. Their work with Bohuslav Klima on the material from Pavlov, published in 1996, described interlaced woven finds from about 26,000 years ago. The impressions at Dolni Vestonice point to a complex plant fiber technology in operation somewhere in the range of 27 to 25,000 years before present. And it isn't crude. The catalog they built from these negatives includes cordage, single ply, multiple ply, and braided, knotted netting, plaited basketry, and woven textiles in several structures, including simple and diagonal twining, plain weave, and twill. All of it made from plant fiber, not sinew, not hide strips, plants processed and spun. That one observation pushed the origins of weaving back by thousands of years and rearranged the picture of what Ice Age life looked like. Because netting changes what you can catch, and cordage changes what you can carry, and cloth changes what you can wear, and none of it fossilizes. There's a whole vanished half of this technology, the soft half, the woven half that we only know about because somebody set a piece of cloth down on wet mud and then put the mud in a fire. Soffer's broader point, which she made repeatedly and not always to a receptive audience, was that a picture of the Ice Age built entirely on stone tools and hunting weapons is a picture with most of the work missing from it. The clay from this valley is the accidental archive of that missing half. There's one more thing from these sites, and it's the thing people remember longest. In the spring of 1986, excavation at Dolni Vestonice uncovered a grave holding 3 people, placed together in a single deliberate arrangement. They're catalogued as DV13, DV14, and DV15, and they were all young. 17 to 19 years old, 16 to 17, and in the center, someone about 20. The one in the middle had a severe skeletal condition, spinal curvature, an asymmetrical skull, an underdeveloped right leg, unusual tooth and pelvic form. It may well have been congenital. One proposal in the literature is a genetic disorder called chondrodysplasia calcificans punctata. That person did not have an easy body to live in a landscape that punished weakness, and they reached about 20 anyway. Somebody carried them, fed them, kept them. The arrangement is what everyone argues about. The one on the left lay on his side facing the central figure, hands reaching toward the pelvic region. The one on the right lay face down. Red ochre had been sprinkled over all 3 heads and again between the legs of the individual in the center. Around the heads were ornaments, pierced canine teeth, and carved ivory beads. The whole arrangement was covered over with burnt spruce logs and branches. For decades, the standard reading was a story about childbirth. The central figure was taken to be a young woman who had died in labor, flanked by 2 men, one of them perhaps a shaman, in some kind of ritual attending her death. The osteology couldn't settle it because the same pathology that shaped that person's skeleton also distorted precisely the features, the pelvis, the teeth, the skull that anthropologists use to determine sex from bone. So in 2016, a team went at it with ancient DNA instead. They used a method that compares X chromosome sequence coverage against the rest of the genome to calculate the probability of an XX or XY karyotype, then backed it up by hunting for reads that map specifically to the Y chromosome. For the central individual, they recovered 7 sequences securely mapping to the Y, 2 of them carrying the chemical damage signature that marks genuinely ancient DNA rather than modern contamination. All 3 were male. The childbirth reading, repeated in books and documentaries for 30 years, was wrong, and the same data added something the old story never had. The mitochondrial DNA of the central individual and the one lying face down was identical, which means they shared a mother, brothers or close maternal kin, buried touching. The dating on the grave is around 26,600 radiocarbon years before present, which calibrates to roughly 31,000 years ago. That gap is why you'll see this site given as 26,000 in one place and 31,000 in another. Both are correct. They're different clocks. What the grave means still nobody knows. Half a dozen readings have been published and the evidence underdetermines all of them. What it does tell you, with no interpretation at all, is that 3 young men died close enough together in time to share a grave, that somebody arranged them with care, ornamented them, covered them in ochre and burnt wood, and that one of them had spent his whole short life in a body that needed help. There's another grave here too, found in 1949, a woman between about 36 and 45, laid on her right side in a tightly crouched position, covered with red ochre, with two mammoth shoulder blades placed over her. Her skull was badly damaged, partly by injury and partly by 26,000 years in the ground, and it was pieced back together in the 1950s. The face was markedly asymmetrical, the result, on the standard reading, of a serious trauma in childhood that she survived and then lived with for decades. Mikhail Gerasimov attempted the first reconstruction of her face in 1968. A newer team went back with CT scanning and three-dimensional surface scans to try again. Even they note carefully that although the asymmetry of the bone is obvious, exactly how much of it showed in her living face is a judgment call. A small carved ivory head from these sites with an uneven face has often been linked to her. Treat that link as a story people find appealing rather than something established. It's a suggestion that has circulated widely, not a finding. Put it all together and you get a portrait of a place that keeps refusing to be simple. They hunted mammoth and built with the bones. They wove cloth and netting out of plants thousands of years before anyone thought weaving existed. They kept people alive whose bodies made survival hard. They buried their dead with ornaments and ochre and fire. And they invented a material that had never existed and used it to make animals and women and small handheld lumps and put a great many of them into a fire that broke them. Whether the breaking was the purpose or just the price of being first, we can't settle from here, and the people arguing about it are arguing in good faith on both sides. But the sequence isn't in doubt. Figures before vessels. Meaning before storage. Every ceramic thing in the world descends from this: the tile on a roof, the porcelain in a kitchen, the spark plug, the heat shield, the chip in the machine you're watching this on. All of it starts with somebody in a cold valley in Moravia picking up a handful of the ground, wetting it, shaping something that was no use to anyone, and deciding to see what the fire would do with it. The print is still there.